I was cooking dinner in my father-in-law's house when he said, "He's late again." I laughed until he touched my. The worst part is, I didn't pull away fast enough. I told myself it was loneliness. I told myself it was grief. I told myself my marriage was already dying long before anything happened. But the truth is, I let the wrong man make me feel seen, and now my husband is about to find out that the person who betrayed him wasn't just his wife. It was the man he called Dad. I never planned to move into Glenn Shaw's house. I never planned to share a kitchen with my father-in-law, learn the sound of his footsteps at night, or know exactly how he liked his coffee. It was supposed to be temporary. That was the word my husband, Guy, kept using. Temporary. Just a few months in Tulsa, Oklahoma, until Glenn could breathe again after losing Gail. Gail Shaw was Guy's mother. Glenn was technically Guy's stepfather, but nobody in the family used that word. Guy's biological father had left when Guy and his sister May were young. Glenn was the man who raised them, went to their school events, paid for braces, taught Guy how to drive, and walked May down the aisle when she got married. So to Guy, Glenn was Dad. To May, Glenn was Dad. And to me, after I married Guy Ford, Glenn became my father-in-law. When Gail died, the house changed. I had only known her as a quiet, gentle woman who always carried a notebook in her purse because she used to write for a small local newsletter. She wasn't loud or dramatic. She noticed things. She noticed when Guy forgot to thank me. She noticed when I looked tired. Once, during Sunday dinner, she told him, "Don't treat your wife like furniture just because she's always there." We all laughed then. I don't laugh about it now. After her funeral, Glenn's brick house in the Tulsa suburbs felt frozen. Gail's books were still beside the couch. Her reading glasses were still on the small table by the window. Her favorite mug was still in the cabinet. Glenn barely touched anything. He walked through that house like a man who had lost not only his wife, but the version of himself that knew what to do next. Guy said, "We can't just leave him there alone, Beth." I wanted to say we could help without moving in. I wanted to say our marriage already felt stretched thin. I wanted to say I didn't want to become a caretaker in someone else's grief. But Guy looked exhausted and guilty, and I didn't want to be the wife who made it harder. So I said yes. At the time, Guy worked as a medical supply agent, and his manager, Ted Price, had been giving him more accounts across Oklahoma and nearby states. Guy kept saying the extra work was good for us. More commissions. More savings. A better chance at buying a house of our own. I worked as a clerk at a doctor's office, so my schedule was steady. I could be home most evenings. It made sense on paper. That was the problem. So many bad choices make sense on paper before they ruin your life. We moved into Glenn's spare room with 2 suitcases, a few boxes, and the promise that it would only be for a few months. The first weeks were awkward, but calm. I cooked dinner because I got home before Guy. Glenn helped around the house because he didn't know how to sit still. He was a retired teacher, and he had that teacher habit of making everything feel like a lesson, but not in an annoying way. If the porch light flickered, he fixed it. If the sink made a strange sound, he listened carefully and explained what might be wrong. If I mentioned I liked cinnamon in coffee, cinnamon appeared beside the coffee maker the next morning. Nothing about him seemed dangerous. That sounds stupid now, but it is true. Glenn didn't flirt with me. He didn't make inappropriate jokes. He didn't stare. He was polite, soft-spoken, and careful. He seemed like a grieving man trying not to become a burden. Guy, meanwhile, became less and less present. He was home physically sometimes, but emotionally, he was somewhere else. He took calls during dinner. He answered emails in bed. He left early and came home late. Some weeks he traveled for work and came back acting like I should be grateful he was exhausted instead of angry that he was gone. I tried talking to him at first. One night, while Glenn was already upstairs, I sat beside Guy on the couch and said, "I feel like I'm married to your schedule, not you." Guy didn't even look up from his phone right away. When he finally did, he rubbed his eyes and said, "Beth, please. I can't do this tonight." I asked, "When can we do it?" He sighed. "I'm working this much for us." That sentence became a wall. Every time I tried to say I was lonely, Guy reminded me he was providing. Every time I said I missed him, he said I knew what his job required. Every time I cried, he looked like my feelings were another bill he didn't have money to pay. So I stopped crying where he could see me. I learned to be quiet. I learned to say, "Long day," when someone asked what was wrong. I learned to make dinner for 3 people and pretend it didn't hurt when one plate stayed in the microwave until almost midnight. Glenn noticed before Guy did. I'm not saying that to excuse what happened. I know people will read this and think I'm building a soft little staircase toward betrayal, one sad sentence at a time. Maybe I am. Maybe that's exactly what cheaters do. They turn their selfishness into a tragic story so they can survive looking at themselves. But Glenn did notice. If I was quiet at dinner, he would ask, "Rough day at the office?" If Guy texted that he would be late again, Glenn would look at the empty chair and say, "That's not fair to you." If I stood at the sink too long, staring at nothing, he would gently say my name like he was calling me back from somewhere. At first, it felt harmless. Almost fatherly. I told myself he was lonely and I was lonely, and maybe we were just two people living in the same sad house. Then our anniversary happened. Guy and I had been married 6 years. I didn't expect anything huge. I knew money was tight and work was busy. But I wanted one night. One dinner. One moment where I felt like his wife instead of a woman waiting for him to remember she existed. I left work early. I stopped by a bakery in downtown Tulsa and bought a small cake because it looked close to the one we had at our wedding. I cooked dinner in Glenn's kitchen. I changed into a navy dress Guy used to like. I even lit candles, which felt ridiculous in my father-in-law's dining room, but I wanted to try. At 7:10, Guy texted me. Sorry. Meeting ran over. Ted wants us at dinner with a client. Don't wait up. Love you. Not a call. Not an apology with a plan to make it up to me. Just a text. I stood there holding my phone while the food got cold. Glenn came downstairs and stopped at the entrance to the dining room. He saw the candles. The cake. The 2 plates. Me standing there in that stupid dress, trying not to cry because crying would make it real. He said, he's late again. I laughed because if I didn't laugh, I was going to break. I said, that's kind of his thing now. Glenn stepped closer. Beth. I shook my head. Don't. Please don't be nice to me right now. He didn't listen. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. For a while, he didn't say anything. That almost made it worse. Guy always filled silence with excuses. Glenn just let the silence tell the truth. Then he said, you deserve more than leftovers of someone's life. I should have stood up. I should have said, that is your son. I should have remembered that grief does not make a person safe and loneliness does not make a feeling right. Instead, I whispered, then why does nobody want to give me more? Glenn reached across the table and touched my hand. It was not a dramatic touch. Not at first. Just his fingers over mine. Warm. Steady. Careful. The kind of touch that made me realize how long it had been since anyone touched me like they were actually paying attention. I pulled my hand back, but not fast enough. Something shifted after that. Nothing physical happened that night. Glenn ate dinner with me because he said food shouldn't go to waste. I blew out the candles before they burned too low. I put the cake in the fridge and went upstairs before Guy came home. When Guy slipped into bed after midnight, he smelled like steakhouse smoke and expensive cologne. He kissed my shoulder and murmured, sorry about tonight. I kept my eyes closed and said, it's fine. But it wasn't fine. The next morning, there was a cup of coffee waiting for me beside the sink. Cinnamon already stirred in. Glenn was outside sweeping the porch, pretending he hadn't done it on purpose. And I pretended not to notice how much it mattered. After that, the line moved in small ways. That is the part people don't understand until they are already in it. The line does not always get crossed in one wild moment. Sometimes it moves an inch at a time while you keep telling yourself you are still standing on the right side. Glenn and I started talking after dinner. At first, it was about normal things. Work. The house. Gail's old writing. Guy's schedule. May's kids. But then it became more personal. He asked if I had always wanted children. I told him Guy and I kept putting it off because life never felt stable. He asked if I was happy. I told him I didn't know what happy was supposed to feel like anymore. He told me Gail had known how to make a house feel alive. I told him I didn't even know how to make my own marriage feel alive. One evening, Guy called to say he had to stay overnight in Oklahoma City because an appointment got moved. I was folding laundry in the living room when Glenn sat in the chair nearby and said, I hate watching him make you small. I said, he doesn't make me small. Glenn looked at me sadly. Then why do you keep disappearing? That sentence stayed with me. I hated that it stayed with me. I started dressing nicer on days I knew Guy would be gone. I told myself it was for me. I started lingering in the kitchen when Glenn made tea at night. I told myself I just wasn't tired. I started telling Glenn things I should have told my husband. I told myself Guy had already stopped listening. Then one night, I was crying in the laundry room because Guy had canceled another weekend plan, and Glenn found me there. He didn't hug me right away. He stood by the doorway and said, you don't have to pretend in this house. I said, I don't know how to stop. Then he stepped closer and put his arms around me. I cried into his shirt like I had been waiting months for permission to fall apart. That was the first time I knew I was in trouble. Not because he hugged me. Because I didn't want him to let go. I avoided him for 2 days after that. I ate breakfast quickly. I stayed late at the doctor's office pretending there was extra paperwork. I took longer routes home. When Glenn asked if he had upset me, I said I was just tired. He nodded like he understood. That almost made it worse. Because he didn't push. He didn't demand. He just waited. Guy noticed nothing. Or maybe he noticed and chose not to ask. That was the story of us by then. Me drowning quietly. Him calling it a rough patch. A week later, Guy came home early for once. He brought grocery store flowers and set them on the counter while I was washing dishes. I looked at them and felt nothing. That scared me. He said, I know I've been gone a lot. I said, yeah. He said, Ted's been riding me hard. But I think this will calm down soon. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to grab onto that sentence and pull myself back into my marriage. But Glenn was sitting at the dining table behind us, reading a book, and I could feel his silence more than Guy's apology. Guy stepped behind me and kissed the side of my head. I should have turned around. I should have hugged him. I should have chosen my husband in that tiny moment before everything became uglier. Instead, I kept washing the same plate until my hands hurt. That night, Guy fell asleep early. I went downstairs for water and found Glenn in the kitchen. He said, you look sadder when he's home. I snapped, don't say things like that. He looked down. I'm sorry. I said, no, you're not. He looked at me then, and I saw it. The thing I had been pretending not to see. Not pity. Not fatherly concern. Want. I should have walked away. Instead, I stood there. He said, very quietly, I know this is wrong. I said, then stop. He answered, I've tried. And then he kissed me. It was not beautiful. It was not romantic. It was terrifying. I pulled away almost immediately and said, no. No, this can never happen again. Glenn said, I know. I went upstairs shaking. I got into bed beside my husband, and he moved in his sleep, putting his hand on my waist like he still had any idea who I was. I stared at the ceiling until morning. For 2 days, I acted like nothing had happened. Glenn did the same. We became painfully polite. Good morning. Coffee's ready. Did you lock the back door? Guy left for another work trip, and I told myself I was relieved. I wasn't relieved. I was waiting. That is the ugliest truth in this whole story. When the second kiss happened, I didn't pull away as fast. By the end of that month, I had become 2 different women. When Guy was home, I played wife. I packed his lunch if he had an early drive. I asked about clients. I sat beside him on the couch and let him talk about numbers and commissions and how Ted was impossible to please. I smiled when he said, once things settle down, we'll get our own place again. When Guy was gone, the house changed. Glenn and I became quieter, closer, worse. We cooked together. We talked too late. We stood too near. I kept telling myself we were not really having an affair as long as I didn't name it. But betrayal does not need a name to be real. And by the time Glenn told me he loved me, I had already betrayed Guy so many times in my head that saying it back felt less like a decision and more like finally admitting what kind of person I had become. That is where I will stop for now, because this is the part of the story where I stopped being lonely and started being cruel. The first time Glenn told me he loved me, I actually got angry. Not because I didn't want to hear it. That would be a lie. I got angry because once he said it, there was no more pretending this was just comfort. No more pretending it was a strange kind of grief. No more pretending we were 2 lonely people who had accidentally leaned too close to each other in a sad house. He said it in the kitchen, of all places. Guy was in Stillwater for work, May had called earlier to check on Glenn, and I had spent the whole evening acting like a normal person. I cooked chicken. Glenn washed the dishes. We talked about nothing. Weather, errands, the leaky faucet in the half bathroom. Normal things. Safe things. Then I reached for a towel and Glenn reached for it at the same time, and our hands touched. I pulled away like his skin had burned me. He looked at me and said, Beth, I love you. I stared at him. Then I laughed. It came out sharp and ugly. Not happy. Not flattered. Just panicked. I said, do not say that to me. He said, I'm not trying to scare you. I said, you should be scared. You should be terrified. That's your son upstairs in the framed photos. That's your wife's house. That's my husband's family. You don't get to say that like it's beautiful. He looked hurt, and I hated that I cared. He said, I know what this is. I said, no, you don't. Because if you did, you wouldn't be saying things like that. Then I went upstairs and locked myself in the bathroom. I sat on the edge of the tub with my phone in my hand, staring at Guy's name. I almost called him. I almost told him right then. Not everything. Not the worst parts. Just enough to make the house impossible. Just enough to force myself out. But then I imagined his voice. Tired. Confused. Hurt. I imagined him saying, what do you mean, my dad? And I couldn't do it. So I did what cowards do. I waited until the panic passed, then went to bed. The next morning, Glenn had left early. There was no coffee waiting for me. No cinnamon beside the mug. No quiet look across the kitchen. Just silence. And I missed him. That was the moment I should have hated myself enough to stop. Instead, I hated Guy for not making me miss him like that anymore. I know that sounds insane. I know it sounds cruel. But that is how twisted my mind had become. Everything Guy did became evidence against him. If he worked late, he was abandoning me. If he came home early, he was interrupting the only place I felt wanted. If he kissed me, it felt too late. If he apologized, it felt like a performance. I turned my husband into the villain because I needed someone else to be worse than me. Then Guy started trying. Not in a dramatic way at first. Small things. He came home with takeout from the Thai place I liked. He asked me if I wanted to go for a walk after dinner. He left his phone on the kitchen counter instead of carrying it around like a second heart. He told Ted Price he couldn't take a weekend client trip because it was our first free weekend in months. And I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt trapped. One Friday, Guy came home before 6 with flowers and 2 movie tickets. Real tickets, printed from the theater kiosk because he knew I used to keep ticket stubs in an old box. He held them up and smiled like he was nervous. He said, I thought maybe we could get out of the house tonight. Just us. I looked at him, and for 1 second, I saw the man I married. Not the tired medical supply agent who lived out of his car and answered emails at midnight. Not the husband I had built resentment around like a wall. I saw Guy. The man who used to make me laugh in grocery store aisles. The man who once drove 40 minutes back to a gas station because I forgot my favorite scarf there. The man who cried quietly at his mother's funeral and still asked if I had eaten that day. I almost said yes. Then Glenn walked in from the backyard. He saw the flowers. The tickets. Guy's hopeful face. Something changed in Glenn's eyes. He smiled, but it looked forced. He said, that's nice. You two should go. Guy didn't notice anything. But I did. And the fact that I noticed Glenn's pain before Guy's effort told me exactly how far gone I was. At the movie theater, Guy tried. He really tried. He bought popcorn even though he said it was overpriced. He held my hand during the previews. Halfway through the movie, he leaned close and whispered, I missed this. I should have whispered it back. Instead, all I could think was that Glenn was alone in the house, probably sitting in the living room with Gail's old books around him, waiting for us to come home. When Guy squeezed my hand, I felt guilty. Not guilty for betraying him. Guilty because part of me wished I was back at the house. After the movie, we sat in Guy's truck in the parking lot. He didn't start the engine right away. He said, Beth, I know I haven't been great. I looked out the window. He continued, I know I made everything about work. I know you've been carrying more than you should. And I'm sorry. I wanted to scream. Not because he was wrong. Because he was right. Because he was finally saying the words I had begged for months ago. Because he had finally turned toward me when I had already turned somewhere else. I said, why now? He looked confused. What do you mean? I said, why now, Guy? Why after I stopped asking? He swallowed. Because I realized you stopped asking. That should have broken me open. Instead, it made me colder. I said, so I had to go quiet for you to notice? He looked down at the steering wheel. Maybe. And I'm sorry. We drove home in silence. When we got back, Glenn was in the kitchen, pretending to read mail. Guy went upstairs to change, and Glenn looked at me. He didn't ask how it went. He just said, he's trying now. I said, don't. Glenn said, I'm just saying. I said, no. You're not just saying. You're scared. He went still. Then he said, of course I'm scared. I lost Gail. I lived in this house with nothing but ghosts. Then you came here and made it feel alive again. I whispered, I'm not yours. He said, are you his? I slapped him. Not hard enough to injure him. Hard enough to shock both of us. The sound cracked through the kitchen, and for one terrifying second, I thought Guy had heard. But the upstairs shower turned on, and the house swallowed the moment. Glenn held his cheek and looked at me, not angry. Almost sad. He said, you already know the answer. I walked away because I hated that I didn't. After that night, things became darker. Not louder. Not messier on the outside. But darker under the surface. Glenn started acting more jealous, but quietly. If Guy hugged me, Glenn would leave the room. If Guy made plans with me, Glenn would suddenly look older, smaller, more abandoned. If I laughed at something Guy said, Glenn would become silent for the rest of the night. He never said, choose me. He didn't have to. I started feeling responsible for his loneliness the same way I used to feel responsible for Guy's stress. That is probably the ugliest pattern in my life. I mistake guilt for love. Tess Webb, my friend from high school, noticed something was wrong before anyone else. She worked as a cashier at a grocery store near downtown Tulsa, and sometimes I stopped there after work just so I could talk to someone who didn't live inside that house. One afternoon, she looked at me while scanning a bag of apples and said, you look like you're about to confess to murder. I said, that's dramatic. She said, you're dramatic when you're hiding something. I laughed it off, but she didn't. After her shift, we sat in her car behind the store. I didn't tell her everything. I wasn't brave enough. But I told her I had feelings I shouldn't have. I told her it was someone close to Guy. I told her I had messed up and didn't know how to climb back out. Tess stared at me for a long time. Then she said, please tell me it's not his father. I didn't answer. She covered her mouth. I started crying. Tess didn't call me names. Honestly, I almost wish she had. It might have been easier than the way she looked at me, like she was watching someone step in front of a train and couldn't reach them in time. She said, Beth, you need to leave that house tonight. I said, I can't. Yes, you can. No, I mean I can't. Guy will know something's wrong. Glenn will. She cut me off. Listen to yourself. You're worried about how the man you're cheating with will feel if you stop cheating. That shut me up. She said, I love you, but this is not some tragic romance. This is going to destroy Guy. And Glenn knows that. He raised him. That makes it worse. I wiped my face and said, my marriage was already broken. Tess said, then end the marriage. Don't burn down the whole family and call it closure. I hated her in that moment. Not because she was wrong. Because she refused to let me make it pretty. I promised her I would think about leaving. I even packed a bag when I got home. A small one. Jeans, sweaters, toothbrush, some cash I had hidden in an old purse. I put it in my trunk before dinner. Then I went inside and acted normal. That became my emergency escape bag. It sat in my car for weeks, like proof that some part of me still knew I should run. Meanwhile, Guy kept trying. He asked if we could start looking for apartments again. He said Glenn seemed steadier now and maybe it was time. He even brought it up at dinner one night. Glenn was slicing bread when Guy said, I think Beth and I should start looking for our own place after the first of the month. The knife stopped. Only for a second. But I saw it. May was there that night too, visiting with her kids. She smiled and said, that's probably good. Dad, you'll be okay, right? Glenn forced a smile. Of course. Guy looked relieved. I don't want you to feel abandoned. Glenn said, I've already survived being abandoned. The room went quiet. May said, Dad. Glenn shook his head like he regretted it. I didn't mean it like that. But he did. I felt heat rise in my face because I knew that sentence was not only for Guy. It was for me. Later that night, after May left and Guy fell asleep, Glenn found me in the hallway. He whispered, so you're leaving? I said, Guy and I need our own place. He said, is that what you want? I said, I don't know. He stepped closer. He only wants you now because he can feel you slipping away. I said, don't do that. Do what? Make him sound calculated just because you're afraid. Glenn's face hardened, just a little. He said, you think he suddenly became a better husband out of love? Beth, he ignored you for months. He left you crying at a table on your anniversary. He made you disappear. I whispered, and what are you doing? He looked wounded. I'm loving you. I said, no. You're making it harder for me to breathe. For the first time, Glenn looked angry. Not violent. Not scary in a dramatic way. But offended. Like I had broken an unspoken agreement by questioning the story we had both been using. He said, you came to me too. I said, I know. He said, you said you loved me. I know. So don't stand there like I trapped you. That cut through me because he was right. I wanted him to be the manipulator because it would make me less guilty. I wanted Guy to be the neglectful husband because it would make the affair less ugly. I wanted everyone else to carry a piece of the blame so I would not have to hold the whole weight myself. But the truth was simple. I had choices. And I kept making the wrong ones. The necklace incident happened a week later. It was a silver necklace Guy gave me on our third wedding anniversary. Nothing expensive. A small oval pendant with a tiny pressed flower inside. I used to wear it almost every day until things got complicated and I started feeling like it belonged to a version of me that didn't exist anymore. That morning, Guy had left early for a meeting in Norman. Glenn was home. I had the day off because the doctor's office was closed for maintenance. I won't dress it up. Glenn and I were together that day. Afterward, I went into the hallway bathroom near Glenn's room to wash my face. I took the necklace off because the chain had caught in my hair. I set it on the edge of the sink. Then I forgot it. I forgot my husband's anniversary gift in my father-in-law's bathroom. I went to work the next day like nothing was wrong. Guy came home early. Glenn was in the backyard. I was folding laundry in the bedroom when Guy walked in holding something between his fingers. My necklace. He looked confused at first. Not angry. That was worse. He said, why was this in Glenn's bathroom? My whole body went cold. I stared at the necklace like I had never seen it before. I said, what? Guy held it up. Your necklace. It was on the sink in Dad's bathroom. I swallowed. My mouth felt dry. I said, I must have taken it off when I was cleaning. He frowned. Cleaning his bathroom? I said, yes. When? I don't know, Guy. Yesterday maybe. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. That silence felt like standing under a ceiling that had just started cracking. Then he said, you hate cleaning bathrooms. It was such a small detail. Such a husband detail. He knew me. Even after everything, he knew me well enough to know my lie didn't fit. I snapped, are you accusing me of something? His face changed. Not because he believed me. Because my reaction was too big. He said softly, I asked a question. I said, and I answered. He looked toward the hallway, then back at me. Okay, he said. Just okay. Then he put the necklace on the dresser and walked out. I stood there shaking so hard I had to sit down. That night, everything in the house felt wrong. Guy was too quiet. Glenn was too careful. I barely ate. When Guy asked Glenn about the back fence, his voice sounded normal, but his eyes kept moving between us like he was trying to see a shape in the dark. After dinner, Guy went upstairs. Glenn followed me into the kitchen. He whispered, he knows something. I said, he found the necklace. Glenn closed his eyes. I said, I told him I was cleaning. Glenn opened his eyes and said, that was stupid. I stared at him. Something about that word snapped whatever little fantasy I had left. Not, are you okay? Not, I'm sorry. Not, this is my fault too. Just, that was stupid. I said, excuse me. He lowered his voice. I mean, he knows you wouldn't be in that bathroom. We have to get ahead of this. I laughed once. Get ahead of this? Yes. There is no getting ahead of this, Glenn. There is only telling the truth or waiting until he finds it. Glenn said, then we tell him. I froze. He continued, together. We sit him down and tell him we never meant to hurt him, but this happened because the marriage was already broken. He deserves honesty. I stepped back from him. Together. He said it like we were a couple announcing difficult news. Like we were brave. Like sitting beside each other while destroying Guy would make it less cruel. I said no. Glenn looked confused. No, I am not telling my husband with you sitting beside me like we're some united front. His jaw tightened. So what, you want to make me the villain? I said, you're his father. I am also a man who loves you. No, I said, and my voice broke. You are a man who raised him. You taught him how to drive. You held him when his mother died. And you still touched his wife. Glenn went pale. For a moment, I thought he might finally hear it. Then he said, you touched me back. And there it was. The truth neither of us could escape. I went upstairs and found Guy sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the necklace on the dresser. He didn't look at me when I walked in. He said, Beth. I said, yeah. He picked up the necklace and turned it over in his palm. Then he asked, is there something going on in this house that I'm too stupid to see? I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. And that was the moment I knew part 3 would not be about hiding anymore. It would be about what happened when the truth finally stopped waiting for my permission. Guy was sitting on the edge of our bed with my necklace in his hand, and I swear the whole house felt like it was holding its breath. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse me directly. He didn't throw anything or call Glenn into the room. That almost made it worse. If he had exploded, maybe I could have hidden behind fear. Maybe I could have told myself he was being irrational. Maybe I could have turned it into another argument where nobody really says the truth. But he just looked tired. Not work tired. Not the usual kind of tired where his shoulders sagged and his eyes looked heavy from long drives and sales meetings. This was different. This was a man whose body had started understanding betrayal before his mind had all the proof. He asked again, softer this time, Beth, is there something going on in this house that I'm too stupid to see? My mouth opened, but nothing came out. I kept looking at the necklace, because it was easier than looking at him. That tiny silver pendant with the pressed flower inside. He had given it to me on our 3rd anniversary. We were still in our small apartment near downtown Tulsa back then, eating cheap pasta at our kitchen table, and he had been so nervous when he handed me the box that I laughed before I opened it. He said, I know it's not diamonds or anything. I told him I didn't care. And I meant it. I really did. Back then, small things still felt huge because they came from him. Now he was holding that same necklace like it was evidence. He stood up slowly and said, say something. I whispered, I don't know what you want me to say. His face changed. The truth. The truth. It sounded simple when he said it. Like it was just one door I had to open. But the truth was not one door anymore. It was a whole way of things I had done, things I had felt, things I had justified, things I had let happen again and again because I was lonely and selfish and too scared to leave before I destroyed someone. I said, I'm sorry. Guy blinked. That was all it took. His face collapsed in a way I will never forget. Like he had been standing on the edge of a cliff, hoping the ground would still be there, and my apology pushed him off. He said, for what? I started crying then. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just tears falling down my face before I could stop them. He said, Beth. For what? I said, I messed up. He stared at me. With who? I couldn't say it. He stepped back like the air between us had become dangerous. No, he said. I covered my mouth. He shook his head. No. Don't do that. Don't stand there crying. Say it. I whispered, Glenn. For a second, Guy didn't move at all. Then he laughed. One small, broken laugh. Like his body rejected the words before his brain could process them. He said, my dad. I said, Guy. He said, my dad. I nodded, and he turned away from me so fast I thought he might be sick. He pressed both hands against the dresser and bent his head down. I could see his shoulders moving. He wasn't crying, not yet. He was breathing like he had just been punched. I said, I'm sorry. He turned around, and now his face was red. Stop saying that, he said. Stop saying sorry like you spilled coffee. I deserved that. He walked toward the door, and I panicked. I said, please don't go downstairs like this. He stopped. The look he gave me was almost worse than anger. He said, are you protecting him right now? No. You just told me you've been sleeping with my father and your first instinct is to tell me not to go downstairs? I said, I don't want this to get worse. He laughed again, but this time it was colder. Worse than what, Beth? I had no answer. He walked out of the bedroom. I followed him because I was terrified, but also because some stupid part of me thought I could still control the damage. That was the pattern. Lie, manage, soften, explain. I had spent so long trying to make the truth arrive gently that I didn't understand there was no gentle version of what I had done. Glenn was in the kitchen. He was standing by the sink, holding a glass of water he had not been drinking. He knew. Maybe not the exact words, but he knew from the way Guy came down the stairs. Guy stopped at the kitchen entrance. For 1 second, he looked like a little boy. I don't mean that in a dramatic way. I mean I could see the child in him who had trusted this man. The boy who called Glenn Dad, even though Glenn was not his biological father. The boy who lost one father and then found another. The boy who had probably never even imagined he would need to protect his marriage from the man who raised him. Guy said, tell me she's lying. Glenn closed his eyes. Guy's voice cracked. Tell me she's lying. Glenn set the glass down carefully. He said, Guy, I never wanted to hurt you. That was it. That was the confession. Guy stepped back like the words had physically hit him. No, he said. No, you don't get to start with that. Glenn said, this was never meant to happen. Guy pointed at him. Do not make this sound like weather. I stood near the hallway, crying silently, uselessly, cowardly. Glenn took 1 step forward. Guy shouted, don't. The sound filled the house. I saw the neighbor's porch light turn on through the front window. And Day, the retired nurse who lived next door, always noticed everything. Any other time, I would have worried about gossip. In that moment, I almost wanted the whole street to hear it. Maybe shame deserved witnesses. Guy looked between us. How long? Neither of us answered. He said, how long? I whispered, months. His eyes shut. Glenn said, it wasn't like we planned. Guy turned on him so fast Glenn stopped talking. You don't get to speak first, Guy said. You don't get to explain this like you're the reasonable one. Glenn swallowed. I love her. I swear the house went silent in a different way after that. Guy stared at him. Then he smiled, but there was nothing human in it. You love her? Glenn said yes. Guy nodded slowly. You loved my mother too? Glenn flinched. Guy stepped closer. Did you love her in this kitchen? Did you love her in the same house where Mom died? Did you love Beth in the rooms where my mother's pictures are still on the walls? I said, Guy, please. He pointed at me without looking. Do not. I shut up. Guy looked at Glenn and said, you raised me. Glenn's face twisted. I know. You taught me not to be like the man who left us. I know. You let me bring my wife into your house. Glenn's eyes filled with tears. Guy, you watched me grieve, Mom. You watched me work myself sick trying to make sure you were okay. And the whole time, you were touching my wife. Glenn said, not the whole time. Guy looked like he might hit him then. I stepped forward without thinking, and Guy saw it. That was maybe the cruelest small moment of all. His wife stepping instinctively toward the man who helped destroy him. Guy stared at me. Then he nodded once, like something had become clear. He said, of course. I said, no, I wasn't. He walked past me and went upstairs. I followed him again, but this time he turned at the top step and said, if you follow me into that room, I will never forgive you for that part either. So I stopped. He packed a bag. I heard drawers opening and closing. I heard hangers scraping. I heard him moving through what had been our shared room, removing himself piece by piece. Glenn stayed in the kitchen. Neither of us spoke. When Guy came downstairs, he had his duffel bag over one shoulder. He didn't look at Glenn. He looked at me. He said, I hope one day you understand that I could have survived you leaving me. I could have survived you saying I was a bad husband. I could have survived divorce. But this. He looked toward Glenn, then back at me. This was cruel. Then he left. The front door closed softly. Not slammed. Softly. That sound hurt more than any yelling could have. For a long time, Glenn and I stood in the kitchen like survivors of something we had caused. I expected to feel relief. The truth was out. No more hiding. No more lying about necklaces or late nights or why I avoided looking at Guy when he kissed me. But I didn't feel relief. I felt exposed. Glenn reached for my hand. I pulled away. He looked wounded. Beth. I said, don't. He said, we need to talk. I laughed, and it came out empty. Now you want to talk? We have to decide what happens next. What happens next? I repeated. Guy's life just collapsed in front of us, and you're talking like we need to plan dinner. His face tightened. I lost him too. Something in me snapped. No, I said. You didn't lose him. You spent him. Glenn stared at me. I said, you used his absence. You used his grief. You used the fact that he trusted you so much he never even thought to look at you. Glenn's voice dropped. And you used me. That stopped me. Because it was true too. I wanted to make him the monster. I wanted him to be some calculated older man who preyed on a lonely woman so I could walk away with a cleaner conscience. But I was not innocent. I had used Glenn's attention like medicine. I had used his grief to make my betrayal feel softer. I had used his loneliness to avoid facing my own. I said, maybe I did. His expression changed. Like he expected me to fight harder. I continued, but I'm done pretending any of this was love. He stepped back. I could see the panic rising in him. Beth, don't do this because Guy reacted badly. I stared at him. Reacted badly? You know what I mean. No, Glenn, I don't. How is he supposed to react? Thank us? Sit down and say he understands because his wife and father were lonely. Glenn looked away. I said, you wanted us to tell him together because you thought that would make us look like a choice. Like some tragic couple. But that wasn't honesty. That was you trying to make Guy accept that we were real. He said, we are real. I shook my head. No, we were an escape. The words hurt when I said them. Not because they were false. Because they were finally true. I went upstairs and grabbed my purse. My emergency bag was already in my car. The one Tess had told me to pack weeks earlier. I walked back down, and Glenn was standing near the front door. Where are you going? I don't know. Beth. I said, I can't stay here. He looked suddenly older. Smaller. More like the grieving man I had first met in that house. You're leaving me too, he asked. That sentence almost pulled me back. It hit the same place in me that had always responded to guilt. The place that wanted to comfort, fix, stay, explain. The place that had mistaken being needed for being loved. But this time, I heard it clearly. Me too. As if the worst part of the night was his abandonment. I said, Glenn, your son just found out you betrayed him. This cannot still be about you. He looked at the floor. I walked out. I drove to the roadside motel outside Tulsa where I had almost checked in before and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes, shaking so badly I couldn't get my card into the machine at the front desk. The woman working there asked if I was okay. I said yes, because apparently lying was muscle memory by then. I got a room on the second floor. The second the door closed behind me, I fell apart. Not pretty crying. Not soft crying. The kind of crying where your body makes sounds you don't recognize. I sat on the edge of the bed with my shoes still on and realized I had nowhere clean to stand in this story. I had hurt Guy. I had hurt May, even if she didn't know yet. I had dragged Gail's memory into something ugly. I had helped Glenn become the kind of man Guy would never be able to look at the same way again. And for what? Because I was lonely? Because my husband worked too much? Because someone noticed I liked cinnamon in my coffee? The next morning, I had 17 missed calls. 6 from Guy. 5 from Glenn. 3 from May. 2 from Tess. 1 from an unknown number that I later realized was Jack Bond, Guy's best friend. I called Tess first. She answered immediately. Where are you? A motel. Are you safe? Yes. Does Guy know where you are? No. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, did you tell him? I cried again. Tess didn't say I told you so. She didn't comfort me in a way I deserved. She just said, okay. First thing, you don't go back to that house alone. Second, you call a lawyer. Third, you stop talking to Glenn. I said, I don't know if I can handle this. She said, you should have thought about that before, but you didn't. So now you handle it anyway. That was Tess. Brutal in the exact way I needed. I called Sue Lane, a lawyer Tess recommended. Sue's office was in Tulsa, and she fit me in that afternoon. I sat across from her wearing yesterday's clothes, with my hair tied back badly and my eyes swollen. She asked, are you in danger? I said, no. She asked, do you share property with your husband? I said, not much. We were living in his father's house. She looked at me over her glasses. Is this a divorce consultation? I nodded. She said, then we focus on the divorce. Not punishment. Not confession. Not emotion. Just what needs to be done cleanly. Cleanly. That word felt impossible. But Sue helped me see the practical pieces. Separate finances. Document communication. Don't sign anything without reading it. Don't make promises out of guilt. Don't use the affair to negotiate from shame. Tell the truth where required, but do not turn the divorce into a public performance. I wanted to ask her if I was a terrible person. I didn't. Lawyers are not priests. After that, I called Guy. He answered on the 4th ring. Neither of us spoke at first. I said, I'm at a motel. I'm safe. I'm not with Glenn. He breathed out, but it wasn't relief exactly. He said, don't say his name to me. Okay. Another silence. Then he asked, did you leave him too? The question gutted me. Yes, I said. I left the house. That's not what I asked. I closed my eyes. Yes, I whispered. I ended it. He laughed bitterly. Now, I know. Now that I know. I know. Do you love him? I hated that there was no answer that would not hurt him. I said, I thought I did. Guy went quiet. Then he said, that might be worse. I said, I'm sorry. He said, I can't hear that right now. I understand. No, Beth, you don't. You keep saying you understand because it makes you sound calm. But you don't understand. I don't just lose my wife in this. I lose my dad. I lose my mother's house. I lose every memory I had in that place because now I have to wonder where you were standing when you lied to me. I covered my mouth, crying silently. He said, "Were you ever going to tell me?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell him about the bag in my trunk, the motel parking lot, the divorce counselor appointment I had considered booking before everything exploded. I wanted to show him every tiny piece of evidence that proved I had some conscience left. But the truth was, I had not told him until he found the necklace. So I said, "I don't know." He said, "At least that sounded honest." Then he hung up. May called me that evening. I almost didn't answer, but I knew avoiding her was just another kind of cowardice. Her voice was shaking. "Tell me it isn't true." I couldn't. She made a sound like she had been slapped. "Beth, what is wrong with you?" I said, "I don't know." "No. Don't do that sad voice thing." "What is wrong with you?" I deserved every word. She said, "Glenn raised us. He was there when our actual father wasn't. Guy worshipped him. Do you understand that? He trusted him more than anyone." "I know. And you. You ate at our table. You hugged my kids. You cried at Mom's funeral with us." I said, "I'm sorry." May started crying then, and that was worse than her anger. She said, "My mom's house. You did this in my mom's house." I had no defense. She hung up too. For the next week, my life became small. Motel room. Lawyer's office. Work. Tessa's apartment when I couldn't stand being alone. I told the doctor at the office that I was dealing with a family emergency, and he let me take a few days. I don't know what people guessed. I'm sure they guessed enough. Glenn kept calling. At first, I didn't answer. Then he started texting. He said Guy had blocked him. He said May refused to speak to him. He said and Day probably heard everything and the neighbors were looking at him differently. He said he couldn't sleep. He said the house was unbearable. He said he loved me. Then he said, "You're punishing me because you feel guilty." That message finally made something in me go cold. I typed back one sentence. "I am not your shelter from what we did." Then I blocked him. It did not feel like victory. It felt like closing a door after the house had already burned down. A few days later, Guy agreed to meet me at a quiet coffee shop near downtown Tulsa. He brought Jack Bond with him, not to sit with us, but to wait outside. I understood. If I had brought Tess, maybe I would have felt safer too. Guy looked thinner. Not dramatically, but enough that I noticed. His wedding ring was gone. Mine was in my purse. We sat across from each other like strangers who knew too much. He said, "I'm filing." I nodded. "I know. I don't want counseling." "I understand." "Stop saying that." I nodded again. He looked at the table. "I keep trying to figure out which part hurts most. You or him." I whispered, "Guy." He shook his head. "No. I need to say this once, and then I don't want to talk about feelings with you again." So I listened. He said, "I was a bad husband." I can say that. I was absent. I used work as an excuse. I thought providing was the same thing as loving you. It wasn't. My throat tightened. He continued, "But you had options. You could have left. You could have yelled. You could have told me you hated me. You could have slept with literally anyone else and it still would have hurt, but maybe I'd still have a father." I started crying, but quietly. He said, "You didn't just break our marriage. You broke my family structure. You took the one man I thought would never betray me and made him part of this." I know. He looked at me then. "No," he said. "I think someday you might. But not yet." That stayed with me. He took an envelope from his jacket and put it on the table. "These are the first papers Sue Lane's office will probably ask about. Accounts. Lease records from our old apartment. Car information. Nothing dramatic." I stared at the envelope. He said, "I don't want revenge. I don't want to fight over cheap furniture and a joint savings account. I want clean distance." Clean distance. There was that word again. Clean. I said, "I'll cooperate." He nodded. Then he said, "And I need you to know something. Glenn told me it happened because our marriage was already broken." My stomach turned. Guy's eyes hardened. I told him broken is not the same as available. I looked down. He stood up. Before he left, he said, "I hope you get whatever help makes you stop needing to be chosen by damaged men." Then he walked out. I sat in that coffee shop until my drink went cold. The divorce moved faster than I expected. There wasn't much to divide. No house. No children. No big shared investments. Just the quiet dismantling of a life that had once seemed permanent. I started seeing Dr. Don Bell, a doctor who also handled family counseling and divorce trauma. I didn't go because I wanted to be forgiven. I went because I was scared of how easily I had turned loneliness into permission. Dr. Bell did not let me hide behind Guy's flaws. She asked me one day, "When did you first know you were making a choice?" I said, "The first kiss." She shook her head. "Earlier." I got defensive. "Nothing happened earlier." She said, "Something does not have to be physical to become a choice." I hated that session. Then I went back the next week. Karma came quietly. Guy moved out of Glenn's house and stayed with Jack for a while. Then he took a smaller territory at work and stopped chasing Ted Price's approval like it was oxygen. May cut Glenn off for a while. Not forever, from what I heard, but long enough for him to understand that being a grieving widower did not excuse betraying the son who trusted him. Glenn eventually sold the house. That news hit me harder than I expected. Gail's house. The brick house. The kitchen. The dining room. The hallway bathroom where I left the necklace. All of it packed up, emptied, listed, and sold to strangers who would never know what happened there. Maybe that was mercy. Maybe houses deserve new memories too. I moved to Eugene, Oregon 6 months after the divorce finalized. Not because I magically became a new person. I didn't. I still wake up some mornings with shame sitting on my chest before I even open my eyes. I still think about Guy when I see medical supply vans on the road. I still think about Gail when I see a woman writing in a notebook at a cafe. I still think about Glenn sometimes, and when I do, I don't let myself turn it into romance. I remind myself what it cost. Tess helped me move. She complained the whole time and cried when she hugged me goodbye. She said, "Don't make me regret still loving you." I said I won't. I'm trying not to. Now I live in a small one-bedroom apartment with thin walls and a crooked kitchen drawer. I work as a clerk again, this time at a smaller clinic. Nobody here knows me as Guy's ex-wife. Nobody knows me as the woman who had an affair with her father-in-law. They just know me as Beth, the quiet woman who brings her own lunch and keeps cinnamon beside the coffee maker. The first time I bought cinnamon for myself, I almost threw it away. Then I kept it. Because I am trying to learn that not every small comfort has to come from someone who can ruin me. Guy emailed me once after the divorce. Just once. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't cruel. He told me he had moved into his own place and was doing okay. He said May was speaking to him more. He said he was not ready to forgive Glenn and did not know if he ever would be. At the end, he wrote, "I hope you tell the truth about this when you tell it, not the version where loneliness becomes an excuse." So that is what I'm trying to do. The truth is, my marriage was lonely. The truth is, Guy failed me in ways that mattered. The truth is, Glenn saw those failures and stepped into them instead of helping me leave with dignity. And the truth is, I let him. I could have ended my marriage before I betrayed it. I could have moved out. I could have slept on Tessa's couch. I could have told Guy I am dying inside this house. I could have done 100 painful things that would still have been kinder than what I chose. I didn't choose the kind thing. I chose the thing that made me feel wanted. And that is the part one have to live with. I don't have a grand happy ending. I don't get one of those satisfying revenge conclusions where the villain loses everything and the narrator walks away clean. I was not the hero of the story. I was not even only the victim. I was lonely, yes. I was neglected, yes. But I was also selfish. I was also cruel. I was also someone who mistook being noticed for being loved. My calm victory, if I get to call it that, is small. I stopped hiding. I stopped letting Glenn turn our betrayal into destiny. I stopped letting Guy's absence become my excuse. And I stopped pretending that shame goes away just because you move to another city. Some days, emotional closure feels like forgiveness. Other days, it just feels like telling the truth without reaching for a softer word. So I guess this is the question I still don't know how to answer. If a marriage is already emotionally dead, does betrayal become more understandable, or is that just what guilty people tell themselves when they want their cruelty to sound human?